The last four learning modules of this class focus on specific disciplines, and the first of those is Japanese literature. So before I talk about specific resources, I want to give you a little bit of the lay of the land of this discipline, at least as is approached by both Japanese scholars and Western scholars. Before diving into literature as a large monolithic entity, the first thing you should ask yourself is, well, what am I interested in? Which period am I interested in? Think about that learning module on periodization. Remember that periods demark huge swaths of time, and in the study of literature, whole communities of studies and scholars. So people ask me, oh, you do Japanese literature, what period? Modern or Tokugawa or Kamakura or something like that. The biggest divisions that we find are between classical literature and modern literature, and there's kind of a fuzzy line between those two. But within the former, there are many subdivisions. Classical, in general, indicates, most importantly, a difference in language. And if you can't remember what that is about, you might want to go back and review the learning module on simplification and language reform. So classical literature indicates that the literature you're reading, first of all, is in classical Japanese. But that said, there are certainly modern works, post-1868 works, plenty of them, that are written in classical Japanese. There's also a difference in focus, and there's sometimes a difference in genres, and that's kind of important because genres influence how works are organized, maybe how they are put together in an anthology or something like that. So let's look a little more closely at the genres, the traditional genres in Japan. In classical literature, the main genres are, first of all, drama, and that would include kabuki and no and bunraku. Second, poetry, and poetry, there's many different kinds of poetry, things like waka or Chinese poetry, kanshi, and then once you get into the modern era, freeform poetry and things like that. Histories, like the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. And you might, from a Western perspective, look at the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki and think, oh, well, those are fiction or they're myths or something like that. But they have their own separate category underneath that umbrella of literature, and that category is histories. Next is a genre that we don't really have in the West, and that is diaries and travel accounts. Travel literature, which is one of my specialties, is a genre that really hasn't been afforded much respect in the Western literary world until very recently. But if we look at Japanese literature all the way back to the Han period, some of the very earliest important works like the Tosa Diary fall into this genre. The next category is monogatari and setsuwa, kind of blended together. I like to use the Japanese terms there because both monogatari and setsuwa tend to be translated in English as a tale, but they're really quite different animals. And the last category is essays or miscellany. Miscellany kind of sounds as if you're almost saying etc., but that's not really what you're doing. Zuihitsu, the Japanese term, means that these are largely non-fictional essays, but they're not history, so they don't fit into any of those other genres. So when you go to the library, if you're looking at Japanese collections, these are some of the major families that scholars identify in terms of organizing the study of Japanese literature. So it's very easy, for example, to find anthologies of diaries and travel accounts. I have a couple of them sitting on my bookshelf. And I'd also like to say that Japanese literature is still a much ignored world. I don't say that to be angry, it's just the case. Outside of East Asia, I know that most people are familiar with some of the big names like Murakami Haruki, a modern writer who's been widely translated. But whatever you see in translation is really just this tiny little tip of the iceberg. I remember many years ago when I was a student, was chatting with my mother, and she asked me, well, how much Japanese literature is there really? You know, she didn't know the first thing about it, and for all she knew, it was the equivalent of some tiny, maybe 6-volume collection of something. And it was hard for me to tell her how rich that tradition is in Japan and just how much there is under that category of Japanese literature. So, for your purposes, knowing about both English translations and anthologies and things like that that I'm going to talk about today and Japanese resources is useful. I know that's a huge mental hurdle to get over. Most of my students see the books on my bookshelf that have kanji on them, and it's almost as if those books are invisible to them. I think they feel like, well, I don't know those kanji, so I can't access those books. But if all you know is what's available in translation, then you'll never, ever really become an expert. So I'm going to try and give you the tools that you need to navigate both the English language realm and the Japanese language realm. And as an illustration, I'd also like to say that reading things in translation can be problematic. This will be a theme that will come back when we're doing the last learning module on philosophy. But I wanted to demonstrate how it can be a big problem in literature also. Now what we have on the screen here is a passage on the top from a short story by Hayashi Fumiko, and one translation on the bottom. There is another translation out there, and frankly the other one is much more accurate. And I'm not even going to tell you who did this translation because I don't want to speak ill of the translator. But you could certainly figure it out pretty easily. Let's just say that this is a remarkably inaccurate translation. If all you were reading was the bottom part, if you didn't know what the original was, you could very easily take it for granted. Okay, that's an accurate representation of what the passage at the top of the page says. And actually that passage at the bottom of the page in English reads very smoothly. It's nice English. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no indicator that maybe there's something wrong. And I should say, most translations are more accurate than this one. This is a particularly extreme example, but it drives home this point that you have to be super careful if you're writing serious research or you're doing serious research on literature and all you're working with is the translation. I'll tell you one more story. I was asked many years ago to be an outside reviewer of an undergraduate senior thesis at another school nearby Albany. And the student was doing his research paper in part on the Japanese writer Kawabata Yasunari. And so they asked me to come in and be an expert on Kawabata and comment on the student's evaluation of an assessment of Kawabata's particular writing style and that kind of thing. But the student was only working with a translation. It was a translation of Kawabata's novel Yukiguni, Snow Country. And quite unfortunately for the student, although there is more than one translation of Yukiguni available, he had chosen poorly. And one of the things in the translation was simply erroneous. And even more unfortunate for the student, he pivoted a good part of his senior thesis argument on that particular passage that was erroneous. And it was up to me to break the bad news to him. Now, he wasn't punished, poor guy, and he did pass his senior thesis exam, but it really made me realize how dangerous that kind of approach can be. So let's just briefly look at this passage that's up here on the screen. I realize it's probably more sophisticated than what most of you are prepared to tackle, but maybe just point out a couple things. In that first line, oh, by the way, this original passage is in the Kyu Kanazukai, so it also may look a little odd to you. Here in the first passage, we're told that the character walks toward the station. Let's see. Do we see the station in that first sentence? She got up, swung the rucksack on her back, and walked away from the river. Now, it's perfectly possible that the station is in the opposite direction from the river. There's nothing, particularly bad about that. But consistently, changes like that were made by the translator. And eventually, if you change that much text, it could be really problematic. So, word to the wise, enjoy reading in translation, enjoy literature, but be careful. All right, so let me talk a little bit about bibliographies and about Japanese literature in translation. Translations of literature are often hard to find for many reasons. One reason might be that they're published in a journal. Now, nowadays, JSTOR and Project Muse are all indexed, so, and Monument Nippona actually has published quite a number of translations. Thank goodness we can now search those using those journals using JSTOR. But in the bad old days, before those indices, online indices, finding translations or individual articles in journals was really quite laborious. I spent an entire day in the library when I was a graduate student creating my own index of a particular category of translations that had appeared in Monumenta Nipponica for my own sake. And of course, 10, 15 years later, they indexed the whole thing and then also went live with that on JSTOR. So I wasted a day of my life I'll never get back. But suffice it to say, sometimes it's still hard to find a journal if the journal is not indexed in one of those databases. Another reason why it might be hard to find translations is because they're published as chapters of books. And this is more common than you might think, particularly anthologies will contain translations of short stories as a single chapter, but when that book is cataloged, the title of the short story might not show up in the notes. And so you don't even know it's in there, this big thick anthology, 300-400 pages or something like that. And the short story you want is there, but if you do a WorldCat search, you're not going to find it. Of course, you might find it if you use the bibliography for Asian studies, if you're lucky, if somebody's already entered it into that database. Another reason that translations are hard to find is that when you translate a work, you give it an English title, almost always. There's a few exceptions like Natsume Soseki's novel Kokoro, but generally speaking, when you translate something, you give it an English title. And often the title is not the same as what it was in the original. So, for example, Sasame Yuki, the novel by Tanizaki Junichiro, became, in its English translation, the Makioka Sisters. I guess the editors thought that would sell better or something, I'm not sure. Kusamakura, which is another famous novel by Natsume Soseki, became The Three-Cornered World. Not really sure about that, but there it was. Kusamakura means grass pillow. How that connects to a three-cornered world, you tell me. Another favorite of mine, not on the slide, but I'll tell it to you anyway, is Mishima Yukio's Gogo no Eiko, which is, in translation, the afternoon's tow, T-O-W, like a towboat. And then that was translated into English. It became The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. At least there's an ocean theme there. But still, the title is tremendously different in English. So if you sit down to your computer or your library catalog or some other database, some other index, and start looking for a story that's been translated from Japanese to English, and all you have is the Japanese title, then it's going to be very difficult for you to find what you're looking for. Happily, I can recommend one more thing beyond JSTOR, Project Muse, and BAS. There are bibliographies of translations, both in paper and electronic. So I'm going to recommend a couple of them. One that our library here at the University of Albany owns is the Modern Japanese Literature in Translation, a Bibliography. It's in the reference section. It's dated, you know, it only goes up to 1979, so that doesn't take you real far. But it is still a useful resource. There's another one called Japanese Literature in Foreign Languages, 1945 to 1990, so much more recent than 1979. And it was probably the most complete listing of literary translations of Japanese works into exclusively European languages. It also includes less well-known short stories and essays and translations published in more sort of out-of-the-way journals, journals that aren't necessarily going to be swept up in the index of JSTOR or Project Muse. But still, it's dated. Here's a third resource, Japanese Literature in European Languages, a bibliography dating back to 1961. This volume only includes works translated before 1956, so it's really limited, but it's kind of fun just to peruse, to flip back, because it goes back much farther in time than the other two that we were just looking at, to works more useful for the perspective they provide on historical perceptions of Japan than for their literary accuracy. In other words, you get back into some of those translations that aren't particularly accurate, but they still open a window, if you will. Okay, so those were 3 paper resources, and you may or may not have them if in your own library if you're not here on the UAlbany campus. However, by far the most powerful way to find translations is this. There's an excellent database that's made available online. It's maintained by the Japan Foundation, which is ultimately an arm of the Japanese government, and it's called the Japanese Literature in Translation Search. And it has this impossibly long URL, so I'm not going to give it to you here on the screen, but I will tell you that if you just type in Japanese Literature in Translation Search in Google, it will undoubtedly be the first hit that comes up. And this is what it looks like. They haven't changed that graphic of the woman behind the globe in years. If they ever do, I'll be so confused. There's a lot more to the Japan Foundation website, but this is worth bookmarking, the Japanese Literature in Translation Search. The only problem with this database is that it doesn't list works that have been translated into non-European languages. So if you're looking for a translation of a Japanese novel into Chinese or Korean, for example, the best thing that you can do is try WorldCat. That's not going to help you find short stories, but it will help you find novels, because you can type in the kanji from the Japanese title, and then you can limit it to the target language, say Chinese or Korean, and then find what you're looking for. But as far as databases for finding short stories is concerned, I don't know of one that does that easily to Chinese and Korean. If somebody does know of one, please do email me and let me know. So this search engine is, I think, fairly intuitive, although there's one little trick that I want to walk you through so you can use it effectively. You can choose what language you'd like to have this translation in, and you can see by the pull-down menu what all your choices are. There are quite a few. Really, it's a pretty broad range. They do have Vietnamese, but if you go up, you'll see they don't have, as I was saying, for example, Korean. So as an example, I'm going to use English. I want to find something that's in English. You can limit it by calendar year if you like, and then you can search. You can type in romanization or you can type in kanji. Out of habit, I tend to type in the kanji because then I have less problem with homonyms and things like that. So I'm going to type in the name of the author about whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation, Hayashi Fumiko. I got to find the right Fumiko. There it is, right there. And then I'm not going to worry about this pull-down menu. No, I'm not going to. I'm not going to get that many hits. I'll get more than 10 for sure. So and then you can indicate I want it sorted by author or title or what have you, ascending or descending order. All straightforward. We'll click on search. Took a little while there. And here are the search results. I actually got about 40 hits. So the one thing that I wanted to point out to you is something about the hit results that you get. So here's the author's name in romanization. Here's the author's name in kanji. Here's the original title in romanization, and then the original title in kanji. So these two kanji I read Bangiku, and that's why it says Bangiku here. And then it gives you the title in English of that particular translation. And one of the things that you may notice is that sometimes there'll be more than one translation of a work, and it will get a different title depending on who the translator is. Okay, so each line refers to one particular translation. It tells you what the language is. I had limited it to English, so of course they're all listed in English, and then the date of publication. And you think, great, now how do I find more information? They do say, please click this to see the details, but this looks like a printer to me. It doesn't look like a detail icon. So I just want to point out that's not a print icon, that's a detail icon. So if I click on that, then what I'm going to get is enough bibliographic information for me to find the work. So here we have, again, the author's name, date of birth, date of death, the title of the work, the title of, in English, who the translator was, and where it's located. Aha, this is located in an anthology. The anthology is Modern Japanese Short Stories. How would I have found that otherwise? I don't know. This is just a little short story, but it's one of her most famous. And then it also gives us the page range, which is handy. So now, let's say I really wanted this, and our library didn't have it. Well, first thing I would do is go search my local library and see if it owned Modern Japanese Short Stories. But if it didn't own Modern Japanese Short Stories, then what I could do is go to WorldCat and find the book and order it through interlibrary loan. And I wouldn't even have to order the whole book. I could say in the little notes section of WorldCat, I just want pages 188 to 208, the short story Late Chrysanthemum. And then most likely what will happen is that you'll receive that through interlibrary loan as a PDF electronically very conveniently. So this database is probably the most useful thing I've seen out of the Japan Foundation. I actually met with some officials from the Japan Foundation years ago, and they asked for some feedback about what they were doing, their different projects, and I commented how much I love this search, and they said, you know, everybody tells us that. They had never anticipated how useful it would be, but it turns out that just about all of us use it. So those databases will help you find works that are in translation. And you may end up finding them in places that you didn't expect. Now, one of the things about that database we were just looking at is, in my experience, it only lists complete translations of works, not partial ones. And often you'll find partial translations of works, and like if it's something like a Kojiki, that might be enough for you. You don't need the whole thing, you just need one little part or something like that. And a place to look for that kind of information is in source books. Source books these days are kind of, they've fallen by the wayside. I guess they're kind of passé amongst academics. But when I was a student, source books were really important. I had to buy them for many of my classes as an undergraduate, and one of the main ones was Sources of Japanese Tradition by William Theodore DeBerry. So we're always talking about DeBerry or his co-author Tsunoda, and we say, oh, it's in DeBerry or it's in Tsunoda, that particular thing that you need. It's always there. It's a really rich source. It's an old text now, and I think that's why people don't pay attention to it. Current students don't pay attention to it. But because it's an old text and because so many people in my generation had to buy it in college, you can usually find it for not too much money on the internet as a used copy. And that source book contains really readable excerpts of a lot of the classics. Plus, in addition to the excerpts of the classics, they'll have a little introduction so that you can appreciate more what it is that you're reading. So never forget to kind of leaf through the table of contents of books like this before you give up looking for information. Another great resource are companions to literature. So, for example, I required that for this class you bought the Princeton Companion to Classical Japanese Literature. I left the classical out there, the title. And you should know by now, because I've been assigning reading for it, that it is a wonderland of information. However, it got panned in a book review in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, which I feel sorry for Earl Miner about that, but I always point it out because I want my students to look at a particularly critical book review, not just a laudatory book review, and understand just how demanding the scholarly world can be. There are also a number of guides in English, such as the Guide to Japanese Prose, the Guide to Japanese Drama, the Guide to Japanese Poetry. These guides are all part of an Asian Literature Bibliography series. They're geared toward the non-specialist, and they provide information on available works, critical works, and translations. These guides provide a good picture of what's available in English, but one of the problems is that because they're print, they're not electronic, they very quickly become outdated, sort of old-fashioned, if you will, incomplete in their information. And as we go forward in time, that problem will only get worse. So they're likely to be a good resource for finding out an introduction about particular genres and works in those fields, but not necessarily the best first stop if you're looking for a complete bibliography. There are also English surveys. So surveys fall between cheap bad websites, and goodness knows there's enough of those, and very complex scholarly works aimed at graduate students. In other words, they're really an undergraduate's friend. A survey is a great place to start. Sometimes students come to me as freshmen and they say, you know, I'm really interested in Japanese literature, but I admit I don't really know a whole lot about it, and I need to know where to start. In essence, they want something a little bit meatier than say a Wikipedia entry, but they don't want to get down in the weeds just yet. In that case, a survey is a really good choice, and I have some personal favorites that I'm going to recommend. These give you a quick reference and a guide to a large field, and they're really pretty reliable in their information. These are 3 books by the same author, Donald Keene, and they go in chronological order, not of publication, but of literature, from the left to the right here on your screen. Seeds in the Heart, which covers Japanese literature to the late 16th century, and then World Within Walls, which covers the Tokugawa period, and then Dawn to the West, which covers the modern period. And there are actually 2 volumes to Dawn to the West. One is fiction, and the other one is drama and poetry. So what do you find in these English surveys? They're different than an anthology. I'm going to be addressing anthologies on the next slide. But what we find in these books is a narrative of the field. And so you get a little bit of history and information about different authors, different styles of writing. Keene approaches this from a chronological direction, so you can kind of walk your way through. All 3 of them have very comprehensive indices. They're big books, particularly Seeds in the Heart and Dawn to the West are about the size of a telephone book. These are not small books. And that's why you want to have the indices so you can very quickly find specific information about, let's say, a school of writing or a particular writer in his circle or something like that. They're very readable. One of my complaints about a lot of surveys of literature is that they're not particularly readable, and so undergraduates find them quite daunting. But these particular books are really readable. They're not the end game of any research paper, but because Keene also cites his sources and is so encyclopedic in his approach, it's a much better way to start your research idea, your research paper, than just kind of surfing around and trying to find whatever website you can find. He also includes a number of passages in translation that gives you a feel for a particular writer's style and voice. There are other surveys. They're not really surveys, actually. They're anthologies. What's the difference here? Well, in Keene's case, I don't know percentage-wise how much it is, but I would guess no more than 10% of those books is actually translation. Whereas with an anthology such as those you see on your screen here, most of what you get is work in translation. Usually there's a small introductory essay that tells you the context of the work and tells you a little bit about the author, but really most of it, probably 90% of it, is work in translation. One of the other problems with anthologies, in my opinion, is that often they're simply giving you an excerpt. It's not a complete work. If it were an anthology of short stories, then you're getting the complete work, but an anthology that has lots of excerpts from novels will give you a taste for that, but certainly it's not the whole thing. And personally, I kind of prefer to read the surveys, like Keene's surveys, and then go off with that bibliographic information, find the work in its totality and read it in its totality. Personally, I find reading excerpts a little bit dissatisfying because I don't really know the characters very well. I don't understand the plot as well as I could, and that's an issue. But you know, if you're short on time and you want to really get a 10,000-foot view, little tastes and pieces of literature, then anthologies are not a bad place to start. These are all recently published, these that you see on your screen here. What about biographical information about authors? There are special reference works on that, including the Biographical Dictionary of Japanese Literature, which admittedly is pretty dated now. That came out in 1976. The author provides the traditional Japanese viewpoint on a fairly extensive list of canonical authors, and there really is a canon in Japanese literature. I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a minute. The book is organized by time period and alphabetized with an outdated but lengthy bibliography at the back, arranged by author. So that's in our Albany library. You may also be able to find it in your home library if you're not here on this campus. Biographical information can also be found through the Literature Resource Center online, which is a database you can access through our library in the same way that you access JSTOR and Project Muse. You can access other databases such as this one, and you can access the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Volume 180, Japanese Fiction Writers. This was published in 1997. The information is limited and not necessarily up to date, but as far as I can tell, it seems to be accurate. Here you can see the interface for that for the Literature Resource Center, and you can see their search engine, which I think is fairly intuitive. You can limit it according to centuries, content type, databases, etc. There are a couple other resources that we have in the reference section that I'll mention. One is the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Medieval Japanese Writers by Stephen Carter, volume 203, and that's also accessible through the Literature Resource Center. And our library has a hard copy in the reference section. And Japanese Women Writers, a Biohistorical Sourcebook by Chieko Mulhern. That covers both modern and pre-modern women writers. So there are a number of reference resources in the library, both electronic and paper, that can help you find out more about specific writers. Okay, take a deep breath. Here it comes. The rest of the iceberg. I know you're going to snicker and snort when you read it and you hear it, but it has to be said. At some point, you have to take that big leap outside of English language sources and turn to Japanese sources. If you don't take that step, then you're just researching with blinders on, even if you feel totally hobbled working in a Japanese language environment. It's better than ignoring it. So what I want to do is give you just a real brief roadmap of how these materials are organized and where you can find them in the library or online. So the first question is, where do you find original versions of Japanese literature? Besides just going to your catalog, Minerva or whatever, and putting in the author name and seeing what comes up. There are other ways to find original Japanese literature, and it might not necessarily be where you would expect it. Typically, compendia or collections in Japanese are called zenshu. This is an important term. Sometimes they're called taikei. These are really synonymous in the context of literary collections. You also might see the word sousho or senshu. Sousho is essentially synonymous with the taikei and the zenshu in the titles, and senshu means a selected bunch of works. Although, in my experience, editors are fast and loose with these terms. I've picked up a number of zenshu that are most certainly not zen, because here zen means entire. Actually, they're not really zenshu, they're really senshu. They're really selected collections. But for your purposes. Just know those words because you're going to see them if you're doing a search, for example, on WorldCat. In the Albany Library and a lot of libraries around North America, there are two canonical classical literary collections. One's called the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu, and the other one is called the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei. The Taikei has 2 index volumes. They're slightly different works, but there is overlapping material between the two. Let me just show you briefly what their tables of contents look like. This is the Wikipedia page for the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu, and it gives us some publishing information there. We don't have to worry about it. But you'll see it starts with volume 1, and if we scroll down, we find that it ends around volume 51 in this particular edition. Then they have additional lists of other editions. Okay. But what I wanted to point out is that they go chronologically. So they start with the Kojiki, and then the Manyoshu, and then they move into Heian period tales, some poetry. We've got the Tale of Genji here. The Tales of Times Now Past, the Tales of the Heike, or the Tale of the Heike, and then down here we're into the Tokugawa period. Okay, so that's what the Zenshu looks like. Here's the Wikipedia page for the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei, and it too gives us a list of each volume. Volume 1 starts with the Kojiki, and you'll see the overlap. There's the Manyoshu again, the Tale of Genji. Okay, but there's more volumes in this collection. And then you get down to volume 66, and there's a break. And then with volume 67, you're right back at the beginning of history. Here's the Nihon Shoki. So there's kind of 2 sections to the Taikei. The first part goes up to volume 66 chronologically, and that ends in the Tokugawa period. And then the next collection goes up to volume 100. Again chronologically with things that weren't included in the first collection. And then down here we see the last 2 volumes are the index volumes. And again, the Zenshu itself, the one we were just looking at, the Koten Bungaku Zenshu, does not have an index. So I know I went through that really quickly, but suffice it to say that each volume in these collections is dedicated to either a separate author, a work, or a genre. And sometimes if the work is inordinately long, like the Tale of Genji, then it gets more than 1 volume, 4 volumes, or 5 volumes. Sometimes those are cataloged according to whatever that title is, and if it's a work, that's fine. But if it's cataloged according to the title of the book, and the title of the book is just the author's name, that's not necessarily going to tell you what the contents of that work are. Now, if we went over to the library and we picked up one of these things, what would we find? This is typically how not just the 2 publishers that I've listed, but other publishers of classical literature, this is typically how they lay out a page. And it's distinct from what we're going to see electronically. So I'm going to argue that it's really a good idea to be familiar both with the electronic versions of these texts, for reasons I'll explain, and also the print versions. As time goes on, maybe the electronic versions will be spiffed up and spiffed up and spiffed up, and we can leave the paper ones behind, but we're not there yet. So here's an example of a page from the Pillow Book. And what we have here in the middle is the original text. And then you'll see there's numbers, 1, right there, that little 1. That's a footnote. And if we go up here, we'll find footnote 1. So everything here in this top section are notes. I guess we should call them head notes, not footnotes, because they're at the top of the page. But in any event, they are annotations to explain something about the text. Okay. So what's at the bottom? The bottom is a modern translation from the classical Japanese. And until you study classical Japanese, having that modern translation is super handy. Even after you've studied classical, it's super handy. The only problem is it can be a crutch, and it can also kind of inadvertently influence how you interpret a text. I've had it happen to me more than once where stupidly I looked at the modern text and then later had that idea, that interpretation stuck in my mind, and it made it hard for me to break out of that box and look at the original text with a fresh eye. But that's really the kind of problem that a graduate student or an advanced scholar would have. I wouldn't expect an undergraduate to have that problem. But let's say you were interested in something in the Pillow Book. The Pillow Book is enumerated. This is section 313 here, right? And so if you were interested in that particular section and you wanted to be sure that the translation you were working with was at least accurate for your purposes, one of the things that you could do is find it and find that particular phrase, because these sections are relatively small, and then look at the modern to help you work through and figure out what's going on. In a similar way, modern literature is often collected in compendia, and those compendia dedicate each volume to one author. So, for example, one of the things that we were looking at when we were in the learning module on Japanese language resources and citation was a volume from one of these larger collections that I have in my office. It's published by the Shinsho Company. It's a Shinsho Nihon Bungaku compendium. It has a total of 64 volumes, and each volume is dedicated to one particular author. We have a collection like this in our library also, actually a whole one and then a partial one. And in most libraries with a Japanese language program, even across New York State, you'll probably have one of these larger compendia. If you have a classical and a modern compendium, chances are you'll have much of what you'll ever want, really, at the undergraduate level. I wouldn't expect undergraduates to go out and buy these books, but at least to be familiar with them in the library. Go see how your librarian has cataloged them. Sometimes they're all together on the shelf, sometimes they're bada all over the library, and it's really sort of specific to that campus. So get to know what resources your library has in terms of these original texts. You can also get more specific and find compendia of all one's author's works. So, for example, Natsume Soseki Zenshu, or all the works of the Meiji period, the Meiji Bungaku Zenshu, something like that. So there are lots and lots of different Zenshu or compendia out there in the world of Japanese literature. Japanese literary scholars are experts at compiling these kinds of things. And just because you found one Zenshu of an author doesn't mean that's the final Zenshu of the author. They're also, I'll just mention, the kind of thing that sometimes you can get a real bargain on in a used bookstore if you're in Japan. There are also literary dictionaries, sort of standard literary dictionaries, go-to dictionaries. One is the Nihon Koten Bungaku Daijiten that lists authors' works and literary terms. And then there's the Nihon Kindai Bungaku Daijiten that lists authors' works and literary terms for modern authors. And that includes bibliographic material. I have to be honest, these days, if you go to a Wikipedia page for an author, often you'll find a satisfactory amount of information about the author. It's probably not going to be as detailed as what you would find in one of these things, like the Kindai Bungaku Daijiten. Which incidentally can be either a multi-volume version or a single-volume version. But increasingly, as encyclopedic resources become more robust online, the need to have a dictionary like this is reduced. When I first came to SUNY Albany in 1994, and there was really no internet, there was no World Wide Web to speak of, these dictionaries were incredibly useful, and I referred to them all the time. I still have them on my shelf, but I certainly don't refer to them nearly as often these days. There are also, and I've mentioned these once before, dictionaries of classical Japanese. These are a mix of the classical lexicon, so in other words, a typical dictionary where you have a word and it tells you the definition of the word and a part of speech of the word and its verbal classification and things like that. But in addition to that, The appendices of a classical dictionary will be in some ways like much of what you find in the Princeton Companion for Classical Japanese Literature. A lot of the scans that I've used in this course, like the scan of the big circle in the chronology and telling time learning module, came from the back of a classical Japanese dictionary. Likewise, you'll see in those appendices breakdowns of the solar calendar. You'll find information about clothing in the Heian period with illustrations. You'll find all kinds of things like that. They'll also have, for example, charts of hentai gana. They'll have rank charts like we were just looking at in that last unit on imperial ranks. All that stuff you find in the back of a Kogoji 10. These are also dictionaries that, of course, we have copies of them in the library, but it's easy to pick up a cheap copy. Usually you can find one in Book Off if you are down in the city or you're shopping around on break. And the reason for that is that often teenagers or college students who need these reference works come to the United States, they bring them with them, and then when it's time to go back to Japan, they think, oh, I don't need that, they're a dime a dozen, and so they sell them back to Book Off for very little money. So I actually collect classical dictionaries. I think I have 4 different volumes because I keep finding them for something like $1 or $2, and I figure each one is a little bit different, and they're kind of handy. And then there are indices. 10 years ago, most indices were print only, but now many of them have been incorporated in databases like WorldCat and WebCat. And because these change so frequently, they are really a moving target. And along those lines, I'll mention that increasingly we're seeing, and this is a happy thing, the digitization of Japanese text. Now that it has become easy using Unicode to do this, many publishers are going in that direction. The downside to digitized texts, at least right now, is that they are rarely annotated. Remember those notes that we saw on the previous slide from the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu? That had tremendous information in the form of both the modern translation and the notes. When you look at a text online these days, it's unusual to find that rich information. One could certainly put it in there. It would involve hypertext, links, and things like that. But in part, I think because publishers are still protecting their copyright to some extent on these collections, we haven't seen it happen yet. So there's a good side to these digitized texts, and that is that you can, of course, search for a specific word or phrase. If it's HTML, you can simply search that web page to find a particular word or a set of words across hundreds of texts at once. And in the bad old days, that would take days. Now we can do it in seconds. Internet sites appear on an almost daily basis that have these digitized texts, but I want to recommend 3 in particular. The first is the oldest and the least well-maintained, although it's still a good resource, and that is the University of Virginia Japanese Text Initiative. Here's what their main webpage looks like. This is a collaboration of the University of Virginia Library eText Center and the University of Pittsburgh. To get an idea of what you can find here, you can click on the online texts, and they can be organized either by the title, the author, or the period. I'm going to go to pre-modern just to give you a feel for what's there. And here we see the Heian period. It's broken down between the Manyoshu, the poetry and fiction and other prose and drama. So I will look, let me see, I'm going to pick up the Manyoshu because it's kind of a complicated text in how it's laid out. It takes you to a title page, and you can read the acknowledgments and things like that, but I'm going to go to the text and click on that. And here they have the same information we would find in a colophon. If you need to cite it, that's what the information that you need. And you'll see you can browse a book of the Manyoshu. The Manyoshu has over 4,000 poems, so it's got 20 different books. There's way more than you want to fit on a page. And you can search using this search box also. From poem 1 to poem 4,516. So this is the first book. They give us the poem in that original Manyogana weird funky way, and then they give it to us in the kundoku, in the way that you would write it if you weren't working with Manyogana, and then they give it to you just in kana, and then they'll also sometimes give you some notes that go along with it. So if you look up here, you can see that by this pull down button, there's a lot of poetry on this page. There's an entire volume of poetry indeed on this page, 84 poems, and I could search it instantly by just doing this, find on this page, or I could search the entire Manyoshu by using that search box. So let me go back to this page. You'll see, so they have lots of material in the pre-modern period, and some material from the Edo, but it's really pretty limited, actually. I mean, there's some big blank spaces there. One of the things that's disappointing about this webpage is that it hasn't really been added to very recently. If we go to the modern period, we find the divisions are poetry, fiction, and other prose. And there's a pretty good selection of materials there. In each case, if you click on that, you'll be taken to the page. Let's click on Kokoro, with the basic bibliographic information, and then the text itself. Here it is. So for classical literature, this is kind of my go-to site, but I got to be honest, for modern literature, I have a different go-to site. My different go-to site is Aozora Bunko, which you can find very easily by simply typing in Aozora Bunko into a Google search. This is the main Aozora Bunko opening page. Aozora Bunko is kind of like the Japanese cousin of Project Gutenberg, if you're familiar with that. So what we see on this site, which is really a labor of love, are texts that have fallen out of copyright. So they're now open texts. The publishers don't have to get copyright to republish them. And you'll see a little note here, sort of a political statement saying they oppose the proposed law to up the copyright expiration date from 50 years to 70 years after the author's death on Aozora. But that's the general rule. 50 years after the author's death. Not 50 years after the work has been published, but 50 years after the author's death. Then the work goes into the public domain. And this site is being added to constantly, and they actually will give you a little bit of a teaser if you get down into the weeds of the site and tell you these are the texts that we're working on, and often you'll see, oh, but that author hasn't, we haven't gotten to that 50-year point, so they haven't been able to post it yet. I have a colleague who specializes in Tanizaki Junichiro, and very, very soon that deadline is coming, and he's waiting with bated breath for that. So the organization of this page is pretty straightforward. You can search by the author. Here it says Sakabetsu, okay? You can search by the author's last name, and this is done according to the Goju Onzu, A, Ka, Sa, etc. Or you can search by the title of the work if you don't know what the author's name is, and this is also done according to the Goju Onzu, A, I, U, E, O. This search is a little bit more tedious, I'll tell you that right now, than looking for the author's materials. So let me walk you through it and show you what you can find. I'm going to look under Na, under the Nagyo, because I'm interested in Natsume Soseki. We saw Kokoro on the Virginia site, but I want to show you what it looks like here. So when you call up this page, these are all the authors whose names begin with Na, and if I scroll further down, we see Ni, Nu, Ne, No, right? So all the authors whose names begin with Na, and this list, although it's a little harder for novices to figure out, is also organized according to the Goju Onzu. You start with Nai, Na, Nai, and Natsume Soseki is all the way down here because it's not Tsu, right? If you don't know all the readings of the names, and of course, as I said before, reading names can be difficult, then sorting through this takes a little bit more time. Okay, so let's see, we've got Natsume Soseki. And in Natsume Soseki's case, a tremendous amount of material has been put up. He was quite prolific, and he died in 1915, so they've had a lot of time to include these things. So what we see on this page are the titles of his works, again organized according to the Goju Onzu, beginning with E, and I think probably ending with wa. Yes, watashi. Okay. And they also give you some biographical information about the author. There's a link to the Wikipedia page for Natsume Soseki. And after each title, it will tell you, okay, this particular electronic edition of the work is done, for example, in here it says Shinji, right? So it's the new characters, and then Shin Kana, the new Kanazukai. Now, when Soseki was publishing, everything that he published was in the Kyu Kanazukai. But most of these texts have been converted over. If we look down, we'll probably find here, we have the new kanji, but the Kyu kana. And sometimes they'll give you both versions of a work. You can look up a work under either the Kyu kana or the Shin kana. Doesn't happen all the time, but once in a while. So here we have Kokoro. That was what I was looking for. We'll click on that. And here we have the main page. It has the title, the author again, information about the work, about the data. And then at the bottom of the screen, these are the links that are most important for you. You can download it as a zip file. I'll say more about that in just a minute. You can download it as an EBK, ebook file, or you can click on HTML. I'd be willing to bet that most of you would want to do the HTML. And the reason is that then this whole screen comes up. Here it is, the entire novel in HTML. Now, imagine you were reading this. I'm using Internet Explorer, but imagine you were reading this with Nikai-chan. Then as you're reading along, every time you came upon a word that you didn't know, all you'd have to do is put your cursor over it, and then that bubble would pop up with the definition. How fantastic is that? I'll tell you, I would have saved a lot of time as a graduate student as I was reading novel after novel, week after week, if I'd had that kind of resource. Now, let me say just one other thing. So a zip file is one of your options, and there are people on the web who have put up shareware, links to shareware, that will convert that zip file into e-reader format. So for example, I have taken Kokoro and I have put it on my Kindle, on my Amazon Kindle, and it really only took a couple clicks to do that. So you've got a lot of choices there, and because it's public domain, you aren't responsible for worrying about copyright. Okay, I've got one last resource that I want to point out, and this is really more advanced, but I'll just plant the seed in your brain. That one is the Japanese Diet Library. This is the Japanese equivalent of the Library of Congress. So the Japanese Library is a physical place. It's located in Tokyo, but it has a really user-friendly website. Recently, the administration of the Diet Library has become much more concerned with, let's say, client services or customer services, and they've really expanded the resources that are available publicly. It used to be a real bother to get anything from the Diet Library. You'd have to go. It's kind of like going to the Library of Congress. You'd have to physically go and then request it. You couldn't go in the stacks, yada yada. But now they've put a lot of materials online, and I don't have time to show you everything, but what I will show you is their literature collection from the Meiji period. Although, as I'm sure you could guess, the National Diet Library has a Japanese interface page. It also has an English interface page, which makes it a lot less scary, I think, for foreign users. There's all kinds of news and events and things that they post, and I would encourage you to surf around on this page when you've got the time. Today, all we're going to do is look at one tiny fraction of it. I'm going to go to Digital Library, and then you'll see there are a number of databases one can choose from. What we want is the Digital Library from the Meiji era. Which brings us to this page. From this point forward, this is the last English that you're going to see once you enter into this page, just as a word of warning. You can do advanced searches, you can do theme searches. They do tell you that you should input in Japanese here what you're looking for. It doesn't deal with romanization. So I'm going to enter the name of the author whose work I've been working on, Anazaki Masaharu, and then click on search. He was really prolific also. As you can see, there are a number of different hits here. And what you get in your hit results, if sometimes there's a thumbnail, which is nice, and they really update this on a regular basis. By the way, it's called the Digital Library from the Meiji era, but it actually includes some materials from the Taisho era also. At some point, I think they're going to have to change the title. And so you get a whole bunch of different hits. You get a choice of going directly to the table of contents. And you see it says the table of contents, and the volume information will be shown to the left if you click on that. I'll show you an example. And you can, once you find what you're looking for in particular, go to that particular volume. I'm going to go one more page forward. I think I'll try this one. Here we have the table of contents, so I can decide, oh, right, that's what I want, or I'm interested in this. He wrote some essays on Tolstoy and the Russian national spirit. What if I click on that? And it takes me to what is really a PDF of the work. They must have had a small army of people scanning and making PDFs over the years. And so what you get is a PDF of that, where that particular chapter begins. You can scroll forward, you can do next, you can go back to previous, okay? You can zoom in, you can zoom out. You can also look at it full screen, and you can print it. The printing is limited to a few pages, and they'll tell you the rules right there and what you need to do. We don't need to go into the details, but suffice it to say that you can eventually download the whole work if you want to. Indeed, I will confess to having done so with a number of works. And the really wonderful thing is, and I haven't talked at all about this in the class, but I'll mention it now. If you have the full Adobe Acrobat suite, not just the reader, but the full suite, which admittedly is expensive, but if you have it, you can run optical character recognition on PDF files. For me, what that means is that I can take a text that's 300 or 400 pages long in Japanese, run OCR on it, even though it's a PDF, not an HTML. I can still search it and then find specific terms within that huge swath of 300 or 400 pages. This is super important because most Japanese books don't have good indexes. They don't have good indices. If they have an index at all, it's usually not very good. And so finding information, if you're working with older texts, can be really time consuming. When we digitize a text, everything becomes much faster. So those are the 3 electronic resources that I strongly recommend. You might want to play around with them, bookmark them, just so you have a good idea of what's available. They're very reliable. All right, that's literature in a nutshell.